Okay, so I guess I have one final question now, that's not my final question. On that, maybe that agenda item. So, is there established objectives by hunt unit or statewide or something for the fawn ratio? Because I hear that's the driver.
There is not, and I think that's probably mostly due to the fact that we can manage buck ratios directly through harvest. Fawn ratios are more affected by climatic variables, winter being the primary driver. But I don't know, Cody or Brian, do you want to share any discussions that have occurred in the game division as far as the possibility of having a fawn ratio objective, or the challenges of having a fawn ratio objective?
For the record, Cody Schroeder, staff specialist. Those weren't formally part of our guidelines when we developed them. I think we might have discussed it. I know several other states have, mule deer management plans for like a specific area that have their own population objective and fawn ratio. I think Idaho and Colorado come to mind. Having a fawn ratio as objective because it is tough as an objective because there's just so many things out of your control. I mean, if you see a massive fire in that area and burns and you see a decrease in the habitat, and you set your objective to where you want to have population growth, it's pretty tough to achieve that. You could put sideboards on it, if you wanted. And
I guess what I would say is, yes, achieving the objective could be just beyond anyone's control because of all the variables, climatic, fire, that. But it seems to me there should be at least, like, if we want to increase population, then we'd want to see a fawn-doe ratio of this. That would be the objective if it could be obtained.
And we do use fawn ratios as triggers in the predator management plan, where we have triggers that elicit predator control activities, or one of the measures where a population may be impacted by predators or may be a candidate for predator control. But that's on the lower end. The upper end, we would want to have as many as you could possibly have, 120 fawns per 100 does if we could. So, but the minimum, and I think the science is probably that you would need, somewhere in the low 30s to see growth. 30, 31 is kind of population maintenance level, I believe, and anything above that, when we start seeing fawn ratios of 35, we're thinking growth, but feel free to add.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Wakeling for the record. A fawn-to-doe ratio isn't going to be particularly effective, in my opinion, as an objective. Arizona used it as a guideline, and so the guideline, it was largely an indicator of how the population would be performing, and then could be used to inform the decision on whether or not a tag should be increased. If you've got a really high fawn-to-doe ratio, that indicates you probably got bucks coming in, and depending upon your management strategy, that could be an indicator that you'd increase tags. On the other hand, if you've got one of the questions earlier dealt regarding carrying capacity, and if you've got chronically low fawn-to-doe ratios, that can be an indicator of your proximity to carrying capacity. So it can be useful as an indicator, but as an objective, it would be very hard.
And that's probably a better way to word it. I probably used the wrong term, an objective, and that's the better way to term it. But it seems to me if you were doing quota setting and said here was the observed fawn-to-doe ratio in spring, fawn adult spring, buck-to-doe ratio observed was this, that's, to me, what I'm hearing is two key data points to take a look at when you're then looking at the quota recommendation. So I understand you have a management objective on buck-to-doe ratio, guideline or indicator data point on the fawn adult ratio that you see in the spring. If we could compile that, those are the two key factors I'm hearing that you're ultimately going to get to when you make that quota recommendation, to have that all in one place together. I think would be extraordinarily helpful. Mr. Reese.
You're dead on. I mean, the 1.4 up there would say you've got 140 bonds to 100 does. That's potentially what you start with. You end up with 30 to 40. The biggest question out there is, what happens to the other 100? There's a lot of things, as Tony just said, you know, it'll get to a point where a trigger, maybe you do a predator project, but I mean, we lose spawns to swappers, we lose them to a whole bunch of things, but without knowing what we're losing them to, and they get to a point where we have to put a flag up and go, wait a minute, our pond recruitment isn't very good in that area. Why is it? Is it carrying capacity? Is it predation? Whatever. But I think for most sportsmen that I talk with, that's the single biggest issue that they say, because Cody said it earlier, without the pond, you don't have a population that's going to grow. And I would personally love to see a lot more emphasis on the status of our ponds. Yeah, pond survival rate.
Okay. I texted my wife and told her I was going to be on the road 15 minutes ago. So if there's no more questions, since I'm already in trouble, we'll continue on to 19D. I don't want to cut anybody off, though, if there's more questions. If not, we'll move on. Okay. 19D, development of quotas from survey and population data. Wildlife Staff Specialist Cody Schroeder. Informational. The department will provide an overview on how quota recommendations are developed based on targeted management objective, like a postseason mule deer buck to doe ratio, using data on harvest success and hunter demand, often referred to as the demand success formula. Mr. Schroeder.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, Brian Wakeling for the record. I wanted to kind of lead this one off, and essentially we pretty largely finished off the last item with the information I wanted to share here. But just to reiterate, most of this is an extremely objective process. The targets that we're shooting for are the most subjective. Those subjective numbers are certainly influenced by what we know about things like chronic wasting disease, the fawn to doe, the influence of buck to doe ratios on fawn to doe ratios, public sentiment. We can manage for just about a variety of different things. We can select those. If you look at the management objectives that we established, that we've been sharing, and while we're using mule deer for this example, for bull elk, we use a main beam length. For our antelope, we use our modeled buck to doe ratio only, those being 2 years or older. So there's a lot of things that we can manage for. It gets challenging to manage for an antler size class. We can manage for an age class. That's something that's doable. But the 30 bucks per 100 does allows for an older age class segment to be in the population. It's dependent upon the nutrition of the animals. It's dependent upon the genetics of the animals. It's dependent on the minerals in the area. All of that influences antler growth, and so that's kind of where we've settled. It's also important to recognize that that this objective nature that we manage through, we use those models. Models are all flawed. It's just a matter of how useful they are, what the utility is for our ability to use them. And each model tends to be sensitive to inputs in different amounts. So the model we're using right now, the most sensitive input that we have that we put into it is that the spring fawn to doe ratio. We're looking at the integrated population model. We don't know what it's finally going to look like. We're going to be evaluating it over the next couple of years. There may be a more sensitive input for that model than the model that we're using now. But overall, this is a very objective series of algorithms, and I'm going to let Cody go on and continue to explain that. Those objectives are that we're managing towards, that we're shooting at, that is the most subjective part, but it does have a biological basis that we use to develop that.
All right, for the record, Cody Schroeder, Department of Wildlife. So I'm going to go into just dive right in. So as I mentioned earlier, Brian introduced, I'm going to kind of focus this part on the actual quota development process. So how we go from our model population estimate to, the quotas that we're recommending. And when I kind of look at just a big picture, I broke it down in these three broad categories here. They're fairly basic. The formulas that go into them are somewhat complex, but if you're just thinking of it logically, the first thing we have to do is determine the number of animals for harvest. Okay, and so this is based on our population estimate, and specifically it's based on the buck to doe ratio, at least when we're talking about buck quotas. Now when we talk about doe harvest and quota levels, that's a whole nother can of worms, but for this I'm going to keep it to buck quota. And to your point, Commissioner Johnson, earlier about the buck to doe ratio and management guidelines, I mean, we are using these, and you're going to see a specific example here in a few slides of how we actually use it, how we actually use the buck ratio, and I don't have one specifically on a management objective for each area, but I can speak to one example. Second part of the process is we need to distribute that harvest. So a total number of animals that you want to harvest. You need to distribute that into the different weapon classes, okay? So we call that the demand, based on the previous year's demand. I'll go into that a little bit more detail here. But because you can apply for, different weapon classes, we have specific hunts for archery only, for muzzleloader only, for any legal weapon. We need to figure out an appropriate level of harvest for each of those, all considering the same population unit. And then the third part of it is we need to expand the harvest into the actual quota. And that's what we generally refer to as the demand success formula. So we're going to divide our DBH, desired buck harvest, by our hunt success. So if you just think of that in plain terms, if you have a population and you figure out what it is, you figure out your ratio, and you want to harvest 100 animals, if you just had a simple scenario where you had one weapon class, like say any legal weapon, 100 tags would not get you there because we don't have 100% success for any of our units. We have much lower than that. It's around 50% statewide for any legal weapon. But each different weapon class has its own success rate, and even within a unit, we use a unit by unit, or unit group, I should say, success rate, and it's a 3-year average. And I'll talk about that a little bit more detail. So demand, what is that? It's basically just a measure of interest. And we used first choice applications from the prior year. So it's only 1 year of data for the demand. You can put up to 5 choices on your application. I think the next presentation is going to probably go into that more. But we just look at the first choice, with the basic assumption that you're putting in your most desirable weapon class and hunt as your first choice. We use that. Archery, muzzleloader, any legal weapon, those are the 3 classes. Obviously in any legal weapon you can hunt. The first 2 are specific to those weapon types. Any legal weapon you can technically hunt with a bow as well and a muzzleloader, but most people use a rifle. So this is just kind of just giving a broad scale look at a statewide level. Again, you see this at the quota process. We have our hunt success for the last 3 years. Archery is the lowest, and these are roughly presented in their level of primitive weapon, if you will, even though the modern muzzleloaders and bows are not that primitive, but they are an order of effective range, essentially. So archery hovers around 20% statewide, muzzleloader around 40, between 40 and 43, and rifle, any legal weapon, is closer to 50 if you look at it on a statewide scale. Now, I should note, when we actually come up with the formulas, and I'm going to show an example, we do this on a unit group basis. So even though I'm showing statewide here, And the unit by units typically reflect these, but there are some differences that we see in the different unit groups. All right. I apologize in advance, but again, this time I only have one spreadsheet. So this is what we call the quota array. And this is essentially how we come up with the demand success formula. And I'm not going to talk about every cell in here. But if you look in the top left corner with the yellow stuff, those two cells, those numbers I mentioned earlier in the population estimate, we take those directly out of the model, we plug them in there into the adult bucks and adult does. And if you see right next to it a buck ratio of 45, that's our pre-hunt buck ratio. So one thing to keep in mind is look at that buck ratio that we're carrying going into the hunting season. It's obviously much higher than we want, but a lot of those are juveniles and animals coming into the population, new recruits and things like that. The total there is just the sum of the two. And so we're not using the pre-hunt buck ratio in the formula. That just it's just a calculation to show you what it is. Where the rubber meets the road really is in the lower left there, that post-hunt buck ratio objective. That is a variable that we can change, and that affects the quota, the overall quota for each weapon class. That's where the management, to your question, that's basically where the guidelines come in. If you were to crank that up to 35, for instance, you can probably guess what the effect on the quota is going to be. It's going to go down across all the weapon classes.
Or if you put it to...
Or the opposite.
Or the opposite.
Some of the other sales are just how we account for everything. So, and I apologize, I'm going to be probably bouncing all over, but in the upper right-hand corner, hunt 1235. So we do account for the non-resident guided hunt, and that's siphoned off of the quota separately. So those numbers are from the actual number of tags that we issued for the non-resident guided hunt. So we're not double counting the non-residents in that sense. If you kind of shift towards the middle there where it says first choice applications demand, that's exactly what I mentioned earlier. It's just the number of applications on a percentage basis. So you see 53.7, 6.1, 51 or 15.1. If you're astute and did some quick math, you'll notice that those don't sum to 100%. They should be roughly 75. And that's because the juniors, the way we apportion the junior tags, and this is only specific to mule deer because they have their own deal, we take 25% and we give it to the juniors. And they can hunt archery, muzzleloader, any lethal weapon season. So they're kind of treated in the demand part of the demand success formula. But we do account for their success rates. You can see there, if you move to the right in the 3-year average, we consider their success rate as well. And then we get a lot of questions about this, but we do factor in how many does versus bucks that the juniors harvest because they have to report whether they killed a buck or doe. And so we use that as part of the formula to figure out how many bucks we're predicting that are going to be harvested from the juniors as well. Okay, and so then moving on to the 3-year average of success rates, we have the youth, we have rifle, muzzleloader, archery. And so those are, just what they say, they're 3-year averages. They are going to be divided into the total number of bucks that we want harvested. And this is a simple example here. We're not harvesting does. This is not one that we have a doe quota per se, only the juniors. So if you kind of shift back now down towards the lower left-hand corner where we have our post-hunt objective, like I said, we can adjust that. But to get to the actual quota, well, you see the desired buck harvest and the reported buck harvest, and there's some other formulas behind the scenes that you can't see, but that is where we basically go from, number of dead deer on the ground to the projected number of tags we need to have to get to what we think will be number of dead deer on the ground. Okay, so in this case, it's going to be, our DBH is 387, and we're going to factor in how to apportion it through all the different weapon classes. Some of these numbers are, outdated in terms of the you probably, I don't know, they might not be as familiar, but like Hunt 1331 resident rifle quota, so that's, you know, the any legal weapon hunt, basically. And then if you go to 1371, that's for resident muzzleloader. 1341, that's resident archery. Those are our old numbers that we used. 1107 is the junior resident quota, so 144 in this case. Then we get to the non-residents. The non-residents at this point in time is a simple calculation. It's just 90% residents, 10% to the non-residents. So we've already factored in the non-resident guided. Those were, you know, you guys basically vote on those quotas in January when we set the seasons, so we kind of factor that out. So you're projecting in your demand by the first choice applicants, the success on the 3-year average, and then you have to project it into both resident and non-resident, and in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4 different weapon classes if you include the juniors. And then the total there is just, that's just sort of summing up all the rest of them by resident and non-resident. Again, this is a simplified one. You know, we have split seasons, so we have early, mid, late for some of our seasons, right? So then we got a more complicated version is we got a portion how many we want in the first season, the second season, and the third season. And some of them we have doe harvest as well. So we have doe hunt, so we got to figure out the doe quota. And that's factored in there if we had that example. That is the demand success formula in a nutshell, a big nutshell. So that's how we get to our, you know, harvest population estimate to our quota recommendation.
Can you maybe explain the difference between reported buck harvest, desired buck harvest? How you go from one to the other?
Yeah, so the difference between the desired buck harvest and the reported harvest, that's largely a function of how, okay, so you have a certain number of animals that you want to, you know, be dead on the ground based on your buck ratio objective, the first column there, the 30. You have to project essentially into the future, and we also have wounding mortality factored in to there, wounding loss. And so, you know, a certain number of animals we know will be wounded essentially and reported. And so it's generally, well, it always is going to be a lower number when we get to our reported buck harvest. I don't know if that was clear or not, but there's a formula behind the scenes that basically takes you from what you want to achieve on the ground of how you're going to have it both reported and how you're going to get there in the end for your.
So the 387 is the number of animals you want harvested. Yep. 322 is what will be reported as harvested. The difference between the two is the wounding loss that you're taking into account to then set the quota based off the reported buck harvest. That's where the quota, the numbers come from. Got it.
Yep. Essentially, yep.
I think that is what I'm talking about, what I'd love to see in advance of the quota setting. Per unit. I know it's a lot of paper, but when you start getting questions and comments from cabs and that, higher, lower, and this, you go right to the sheet. If you have questions, when you see changes from prior years, you can go to the sheet and you can see exactly how the department came up with the recommendation. I don't think I've ever seen something like this before. No. Have you, Commissioner Valentine? I don't recall seeing it. This to me, I see a lot of people nodding their head too, and I think it sheds a lot of light on exactly how this comes about.
Yeah, I think that you're exactly right, and I think that, you know, the point that Cody made is this is a more simple example. We've got some elk arrays that would make your head spin, and there are formulas throughout that plug those percentages in, and there's links to tables to calculate those percentages. And so, you know, certainly we can we can share, you know, how we get to that point. And as Cody said, the two yellow cells, highlighted cells in the upper left, those numbers are numbers that we plug in directly from the model. We plug the numbers in the two yellow cells on the right directly from the approved non-resident guided mule deer hunt quota, and then the yellow cell on the lower left is what generates and fills in the quotas for everything else. One of the things historically that I think the department has tried to be cautious of is kind of quota shopping, if you will. So it's really easy to just say, well, what would this buck ratio do? Well, let's put in 31, put in 31 and a half, put in 31.75 there. I like that quota. And so from a transparency standpoint, I totally support, you know, sharing this in conjunction with the justification or form, but I also want to share, you know, my concern that it not turn into, you know, a manipulatable tool that people use to shop the most politically desirable quota, but that we use it to understand where the quotas are coming from, not to necessarily, you know, manipulate, not to sound pejorative, but.
Were you suggesting I was going to
No.
manipulate it? Or?
No. That was the caveat. That's why I said that.
Was that the conclusion, Mr. Schroeder? Or?
No,
Okay.
not getting off that easy. No, this I was just highlighting. That's probably the starting point and where it all the basis of it is. There is kind of if you look at those numbers, and they don't look like the ones that you see in the actual quota, there's a rounding process as well. So, you know, even though we have very exact numbers in here, we are not that good. I'm just here to say it right now. We are not that good. So we tend to round them just to make them more, I don't know, appealing to the eye, I guess. But they're very, very close. And if you look at data and you look at if they're rounded up or down or, you know, difference, it comes out the same in the end. Some round up, some round down. So you end up with the same, essentially the same harvest when you get to the end.
Hey, Cody, if I'm calculating that right, it looks like we have like a 12 or 13% wounding rate going from the desired buck harvest to the reported buck harvest. Is that typical?
It's about 20, what we use.
We might want to relook at the smart rifle regulations. It's a lot. Dang.
Now, I mean, in all honesty, we don't know what the true wounding loss is, but that's what we basically use to project into the models.
Sure.
So.
There's some studies that have been done on that wounding loss, and it really varies in, you know, thickly treed, heavily treed cover. It might be higher. I think most of the studies I've seen are specific to archery. You know, it's going to vary by weapon class. It's going to vary, you know, by cover type. But we know it's the harvest is actually higher than the reported harvest, and so we cushion that a little bit.
Do you want me to do it right now? I mean, I can show you a harvest form, a rec form, that might make this more apparent. It'll take a little bit, though, so you'll have to bear with me. That's not it. I'll have to zoom a little bit. So, okay, this is the example that I mentioned earlier where I don't know if this is exactly what Commissioner Johnson recommended, but Here's what we use internally when we're sort of processing all this information. And we kind of just, more in recent years, developed these forms. It gives you all this information basically at one glance. It's showing last 3 years here, but you can actually have, more cells than that in there if you want. It'll show you what the survey was, what the survey results were. So this is for, mule deer, area 171, 173. Fawn ratio, modeled buck ratio, population estimate, all these numbers. This one looks like it could use just a little bit of cleanup on terms of formatting, but basically all these numbers are there. 4-point or better, what the total antler harvest was, what the non-resident guided success was. And then here is the bottom part here is what was approved by the commission in prior years and then recommended. And these are what our biologists basically fill in, these numbers here on this row for the current year. And then, there's a little formula in here to show whether it's the same, if it's equal, or if it's declining or increasing. Then there's a little box in here where you can fill out a little quota rationale. If a biologist submits this to his supervisor or to me, then I can take a look at it. In this case, you can see harvest objectives indicate we should strive for post-hunt buck objective 30 bucks per 100 does. Slightly reduced fawn recruitment numbers. I'm recommending a slightly decreased quota. So we pretty much produce those for all of our herd units, for all of our big game species. I can tell you there are quite a few hunts and species, so when you stack these all up, they will be almost as thick as the big game status book. But you would have all the information there at your fingertips to look at it.
Mr. Cooney?
I'll speak loud. When we do a report card at the end of the season, isn't there a box in there that asks you if you wounded anything? And if so, is that counted in with the harvest, or is that out there and it drops back to the 20% or whatever that number might be?
Yeah, for the record, Cody Schroeder, Department of Wildlife. It's a great question. There is a question on the questionnaire that you submit, whether you wounded an animal. I think it used to be how many. We don't actually we don't use the data explicitly, just to be honest.
The reason being, though, is that number is always below 20%. We have a strong belief that it would be underreported. So not to say that we don't use it, but we don't think it has adequate value to truly reflect what that wounding loss is. And it is very small. And I think it's understandable that people, I probably missed it. I probably didn't hit it. But the way it's worded, did you injure an animal or wound an animal that you were unable to recover or unable to find? And I think that's tough for a lot of people, and to say that. And I think there's a reason that that's underreported, and there's a bias there. And we want to make sure that we don't undervalue what that wounding loss might be. So it's always well below the 20% that we use.
Yeah, kind of to that point, it's a useful index to look at year over year. And so we can see whether or not it changes or not. But this is just one example of a lot of places within this system that we built a lot of safeguards in. So we estimate greater wounding loss than what we report. The example that we just pulled up, the biologists recommended a more conservative harvest than what the guidelines that we were using would have recommended. Population estimates are almost always conservative. If you look at our measured buck-to-doe ratio and the way it's trending, this process has a lot of conservatism built into it and safeguards rather than conservatism. They're just ways to ensure that the recommendations that the biologists provide don't wind up in a unexpected overharvest. And even in the cases when we do have an unexpected overharvest, it's usually pretty easy to accommodate in a subsequent year.
Did that answer the question?
Yes.
When I looked at it last year, it was 2% reporting. 2% reported wounded an animal and didn't retrieve it. So I think we could probably consider that a minimum, and there's likely some inherent bias in there reporting that people aren't truly honest on there. And then the other thing I'll add is because I've actually looked into the literature before, it gets, not every animal that's wounded actually dies as well. So oftentimes we see animals living to the next year, and especially older, large males like bull elk, for instance, are pretty hardy. So we have strived to be consistent, and even though we may not use that questionnaire data on a year-to-year basis, we try to be consistent throughout the state and not be, having one wounding loss in one area and a different in the other. We just pretty much assume that on average, sportsmen are about the same, whether they're successful in harvesting an animal and how they report it, not geographic variation. Leave it at that, unless there's other questions. All right, so just have a few more here. Just wanted to really dwell on this part. Not everyone's aware in the general public that that these commission meetings even exist, to be honest with you. I wish more people were aware. We get a lot of criticism on social media or direct mailings or just, seeing people in the grocery store sometimes. And I try to always iterate. It really is a public process, and there's many levels of that public process. So this is just kind of a conceptual diagram from going from the quota there on the bottom to, NDOW comes up with a recommendation. We submit that to the Wildlife Commission. The CABs, we submit it to the CABs. We post it online. CABs submit their comments to the Wildlife Commission. The general public can directly contact commissioners or, show up to a Wildlife Commission meeting. And then ultimately the quota is up to the commission. So there's many different steps along the way that the public, if they're so interested, can get involved in this process. And we encourage people to be more involved. The more feedback, the better. This is just kind of more of the specifics of that in writing. NDOW, we post the official quota recommendations in late April. The county advisory boards receive those quota recommendations. They hold public meetings to discuss the quotas. The Nevada Board of Wildlife Commission meeting, typically in May when we do the quotas. The general public is invited to those, and the CABs, they provide input, and then ultimately the commission makes the final decision on the tag quotas. I know almost all of us in this room are very well aware of this process, but just like to hit that home. And then I just kind of wanted to circle back on this. We get a lot about, what are we doing about mule deer herds? Why are their populations declining? What are we going to do about it? We've already talked about these numbers, so I won't dwell on them, but there has been a fair amount of money spent on sagebrush habitat restoration through the Heritage Program. And, these benefit mule deer, but many other species of wildlife. And I think I have the wrong number on there. I believe it's actually 98 when the money started becoming available. But you can check the facts on that in the records. We spent a fair amount of money as well. I don't have a dollar figure on radio collaring efforts. Since 2010, we've collared over 800 mule deer. We're currently monitoring around 185 GPS collars in different areas, so we kind of set our priority areas throughout the state. Some of this is based on ongoing agreements we have with the BLM and mining companies. Some of it's from our secretarial order sort of direction. And just kind of our internal, what we've decided we want to prioritize our research efforts on. We're using those collars to map crucial habitats, winter range, migration corridors is a big thing we're doing right now. We already dwelled on this a lot, but calculating survival rates, using that to inform our models where we can. We're also just collecting other information about these mule deer when we're doing captures, so we collect a body condition. In some instances, we're just getting an index. Some cases, we have a research project in the Toyabe range. We're actually helicoptering the animals in and directly measuring the body fat on the animals with an ultrasound, so we can more directly get at this question of carrying capacity. And it's actually tied to a habitat treatment project on Carver's Bench, so we can research basically how the effect of these treatments are having on mule deer. So we can kind of more ask, we can hopefully in future years come to this commission and give you good answers on did we look at this, did we measure it, what effect did it have on those populations. And this is just a summary really of this last item. So I talked about the quota process in 3 steps, but it's really a fairly involved 3-step process. That's kind of generalizing. It's the quota array based on the demand success formula. That's initiated by our population estimate. We use previous year's demand by first choice applications as part of the formula. Hunt success is based on a 3-year average. We do break it down by 90-10%. We try to get as close to that as we can. In some cases, it's not always possible on a hunt by hunt unit basis, simply because of the number of tags we have is limited. And then finally, the public process involving Department of Wildlife, county advisory boards, and the Wildlife Commission. And we've spent a fair chunk of money on habitat research on mule deer over the last 2 decades, and we continue to actively monitor mule deer using GPS collar technology and also other means as well. That is all I have for agenda item 19D. So I'd be happy to continue to entertain questions.
Any questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Cody. I really appreciate that.
So Cody, if we're going to be given all this new information, I mean, since you guys have offered it to us and stuff, wouldn't it be beneficial if we did I know it's going to be long, but if we did the quota settings with the season settings so we have all that information? I mean, right now they're separated. We do like a season setting and then we do a quota setting. So, I mean, now that we're given all this new information and stuff, then we can actually table it all and see where it actually needs to be divided up into like what seasons for what unit. Because right now, we don't have all that information when we do like a season setting.
So, yeah,
Are you saying move the season setting back to the May meeting and do it with the quota?
Well, I just didn't know if that would be beneficial to do.
From this side of the table, I think we've talked about moving the quota setting up to try to do it earlier. The problem with the challenges of that is that the department then doesn't have all the spring survey information to help with the quota recommendations. I think trying to move the season setting back and do it at the same time as the quota setting would be an immense challenge for the commission to do. And Commissioner East, I think, just recommended, I believe you're applying before quota, which was one of the reasons why could we get the quota first. But when you apply, you know when the season dates are. So if you move the season setting back to the quota setting in May, you'd be applying and not necessarily knowing season dates.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I might, when we look at the season structure, if you were to look at a Gantt chart of all of our seasons by species, by gender, by weapon class, a lot of the reasons why seasons are where they are, some of it has to do with achieving objectives and having a season in the right time of year to more easily reach that objective, but a lot of it has to do with tolerance, overlap, being able to put all those weapon classes for all those species across all those genders. And I think that they've evolved to where they are, and it really is a house of cards in moving one, then it then overlaps with another. I think that the process being separate, and again, this is just my opinion, if the cabs and the commission want to go a different direction, that's fine, but I think having it as that separate process, what drives the season dates and structure has to do with those overlaps and trying to be sensitive to all those weapon classes, gender, species, and then using the harvest as the tool to achieve the objectives within that framework. And then, you know, if we find that we can't get there with the current season, then we come back and we do that as a separate process. But if we, my fear is that if we put the two together, it would be really, really complicated. And right now, I mean, we saw a couple years ago where we tried to change some seasons. The commission took input from the cabs, changed some seasons, and things got pretty messed up, partly due to the department's preparedness or lack thereof. But it gets really complicated in a hurry.
I was going to say you stole my thunder.
I saw that look in your eye. I knew I had to.
Yeah, I just said the discussion is often very, very different, season setting versus quota setting. And I think the only meeting that's more challenging on this side of the table and trying to keep track of all the public input is the season setting. Because the minute you move dates in one, you have to know how does that impact the dates on other, whereas slight adjustments in the quota is really affects non-resident tags up or down. So I think it would be very challenging. And we would be having two discussions at the same time with very cumbersome, so. All right, let's move on then to 19E, the draw process. Mitch Strobel from Calcami Informational. Mitch? Or Zach? Okay. The department's vendor that accepts hunt applications and conducts the random draw for hunting tags will provide an overview of the process involved in accepting applications, managing bonus point accrual, assigning random numbers, and conducting the random draw. I thought today was going to be.
All right. For the record, Zach Lambert. I'm a product manager at Calcami. I'll do my best to be brief without leaving out any important information. If there's any questions, let me know. Before I get started, I do need to acknowledge one error in the draw results report that we presented earlier. The bear tag draw allocation report is only reflective of resident tag numbers. That's why the total successful applicants number was 45 as opposed to 50. So I can confirm 50 bear tags were awarded in the draw, 5 of which went to non-residents. We will provide an amendment to the presentation through the appropriate channels to get that updated. So I think as everybody's aware, this year was the second year that we streamed the big game tag draw live on YouTube. This year, I checked last night, and there were almost 8,700 views. So I would imagine that's probably the most people who have been witness to the tag draw in quite some time or ever. And so the one point of feedback that we've gotten is what's going on behind the scenes. There's really not much to see. So I've done my best to take a very abstract concept and build a visualization of that. I imagine most people here are pretty familiar with how everything works, but I'll go through it and we can answer any questions. I do want to point out, obviously, this is a culmination of months of work from quota setting to season setting to various back and forths with the department as well as the application period itself. So there's a lot that goes into leading up to this point. So when the draw is actually kicked off, the first thing that happens, we generate random numbers for all applications. And random numbers are generated for every application based on the number of bonus points assigned to that application. And in Nevada, we square the bonus points and add 1 for the application that year to determine the number of random numbers for that application. Every application that a client submits gets random numbers with the exception of bonus point only applications, which aren't considered in the drawing. Those are just automatically a bonus point only application for the year, as well as the management cow elk tag, because the management cow elk tag is dependent upon drawing your related mule deer tag. So what I've done is I've tried to create a simple snapshot of a customer, John Doe. None of this is real information. I've just sort of made this up on the fly. But you can see, for example, let's look at the mule deer application. He has 3 bonus points. 10 random numbers are going to be generated for that application. On his bull elk application, he has 10 bonus points. 101 random numbers are going to be generated for that application. That is the first step in the draw process. If any of you watched the video, the first thing that happens is we have a generating entries count, and that count gets up to, I believe it was around 6.5 million this year. Those entries are the numbers of random numbers generated for all applications. So when you're watching the draw, that is actually telling you the random numbers that are being generated. I do want to point out the random numbers are generated using the, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, the Knuth linear congruential sequence. That is what was used by the prior contractor to generate random numbers, and we are currently using that as well. We generate random numbers in the range between 1 and 100 million for applications, with about 6.5 million this year being generated for the draw. So here's another example. So client John Doe, he's submitting a resident antlered mule deer application with 3 bonus points. Because of that, 10 random numbers are going to be generated in the range of 1 to 100 million, and they are unique to other applications. So this is totally something I just made up, but just some example numbers of what may be assigned to that application. Once random numbers are generated for every application, the system then figures out the lowest random number for every application. So in this example, 4,567 is the lowest of the 10 random numbers that were assigned to this application, and that is the number that application will go to the draw with. One thing I don't have a visualization of is party hunts. Party hunts are considered a single application. Only the quota being allocated to that party hunt is the size of the party. So if we have a party with 5 people in the party hunt, that is a single application that gets a single draw number, and that is however many people are in the party is how many tags that party has to draw. The way we determine bonus points for a party is we average the number of bonus points for all party members. We do round to the nearest whole number, the higher nearest whole number. So if it comes out to 3.5 is the average number of bonus points for the party, we consider that a 4 bonus point party. So again, 4,567 was the lowest random number for this mule deer application. That's what it will go into the draw with. So then if we're going back and looking at John Doe, this is a potential example of what could look like for all of his applications. Horns longer than ears has a random draw number. Horns shorter than ears has a draw number. Again, management cow elk does not get a draw number because it is dependent upon drawing your mule deer tag. And then bonus point applications don't go into the draw. They are just treated separately to accrue a bonus point. So after all numbers are generated for all applications and a lowest random number has been determined for every application, applications are ordered with their draw number from lowest to highest. This is done without any preference to species or species sex or horn length. So there's no preference where we evaluate antlered or male applications before female applications. It's entirely based on your draw number. This is actually a real example of the 2019 lowest draw numbers. So the lowest random number was 3. That was for a resident black bear application. And so this is just an example. You will notice that the majority of applications that were the lower ones in the draw this year are harder to draw tags. You'll see there's a lot of sheep tags, some mountain goat tags. There's a non-resident bull elk tag in there. Mainly that is because those harder to draw tags, the folks have more bonus points, so they're getting more random numbers. And again, the harder to draw tags have more demand, and so it's likely that it will be a lower random number for those tags. It is entirely possible, though, that the lowest number in the draw could be a relatively easy to draw tag, such as an antlerless mule deer tag. It just depends on how the random numbers come out when they're generated. So now once we've ordered all applications from the lowest random number going higher, what happens is the draw goes through and starts looking at the very first application and goes on and looks at every application until all applications have been evaluated. So if we go back to John Doe's mule deer application, let's just assume that we've come up to his 4,567 number in the draw. And again, this is sort of zooming in on the application. I've tried to visualize it to where everything above this are applications with lower draw numbers that have already been evaluated, and below it are applications with higher draw numbers that have not been evaluated yet. So the first thing that happens when we look at an application, we run essentially 3 distinct checks. The first is the customer under suspension? We do this because it's possible that a client cannot be under suspension when they apply, but they have received a suspension by the time that the draw is run. So we always check that first when we evaluate a tag application. If the customer is under suspension, we mark the application as ineligible and go on to the next application. If not, we go to the second step. And in the second step, this actually probably the decisions that are made by the commission have the biggest impact here. And this is, does the customer have another tag that makes them ineligible? One example this year, the commission made the change to where you could apply for a horns shorter than yours antelope tag and a horns longer than yours antelope tag. In the past, you could only apply for one or the other. This year, you could apply for either, but only draw one of them. So this second step, using the antelope example, if this were a horns longer than ears application, it's going to look and see, has this person already drawn their horns shorter than ears tag? And if so, we would mark the application as unsuccessful and go to the next one. Same thing with spike elk, bull elk, as well as the, I hope I don't misspeak, but if you had already drawn a Nelson U tag and we were evaluating your ram tag for Nelson sheep, it would mark it as unsuccessful. Third, the most important one, which we've been talking about, is are tags available for the person's first choice. So we've passed the first 2 checks. We know this person is eligible, so we look at the first choice. And I've tried to be somewhat realistic in naming maybe some tags that are a little bit more desirable and then going down to maybe some relatively easier to draw tags. But we're going to look at the first choice and we're going to see if tags are available. If tags are available, that application is marked as successful and the quota for that hunt is reduced by 1, or in the case of a party, however many are in the party. It's important to note, again, a party of 5 would need 5 tags available on that choice before we go to the next one. Again, so first choice is evaluated. Then to the second choice, we check, are there tags available? If not, we go to the third choice, fourth choice, and fifth choice. If no quota is available for all choices, then we mark that application as unsuccessful and go on to the next one. And that process is repeated until all applications, excuse me, have been evaluated and the draw results are complete. That process takes about an hour and a half. That was the process that was live streamed on YouTube this year for the 2019 tag draw. As a result of the draw, there are several artifacts that come out of it. There's a draw results report which indicates the successful applicants, what they drew, the unsuccessful applicants, what their choices were. There's an alternates report of everybody who chose to be an alternate. There is a lowest draw number report. There's a report of all random draw numbers. And there is an excluded report, which would include people who maybe failed step 1 or withdrew their application. All of those reports are what are put on the hard drives. 1 copy is given to the department. 1 copy is given to the DAG. 1 copy is given to a third-party auditor. And 1 copy is stored at Calcami in a safe for safekeeping. From there, there's a 48-hour validation process in which the department and Calcami validate the results of the draw. And things we're looking for there is, was quota properly allocated? Did anybody with a lower random number draw over somebody with a higher random number? Things of that nature. Once the validation is complete, that is when we actually finalize the draw. And every time we've done it so far, the finalized results are exactly the same as the produced results. There's no difference between the 2 files. But when we do finalize the draw, that is actually what charges credit cards for customers and sends emails. We've done that around midnight Friday morning each year. From that, we produce their same reports, and we, again, create the 4 copies for the DAG, NDOW for us, and for the auditor. And those are the final draw results for that year. That's all I have, but I know there's a lot to it. I'd be happy to answer any and all questions for anything.
Yep. Commissioner Valentine?
Okay, so you mentioned the horn shorter than ears, horns longer than ears on the animal. What's the exact draw order
There is no draw order.
Yeah.
The order is based on the lowest random number for those applications for a person.
If you have a lower random number for horns shorter than ears than you do for your lowest random number for horns longer, then it's going to process your application for horns shorter first, and then it'll get to that. So like that individual has a list of random numbers. That lowest random number, despite whatever species, is the first application of that individual that's going to be processed.
There is one exception to the draw order. Silver State is processed before all their applications.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. It's codified something that I thought about for years.
The other one that's come up quite a bit with that interaction would be the case where, let's say, a party of 5 put in for a buck tag, and one of that party of 5 also put in for a doe tag. That one person could potentially draw that doe tag before the party is evaluated. That person is removed from the party, and then the party is basically -1 for their application. So we did have a few customers call us asking what may have happened there as well.
I think we have a question.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman Johnson and Commission, and for the record, my name is Joel McConnell. It's more of a statement, I guess, than a question, but it appears, in my opinion anyways, that there's some sort of a discrepancy as well between what's stated in the big game status or season and application guideline versus how the actual draw system is being processed. And what I mean by that is just kind of elaborating on this draw sequence. In the big game status book, it states that if you apply for an antlered elk tag, that you can also apply for a spike tag and also the antlered elk depredation tag. Yet if you go into your Calcami system and process your application, as soon as you apply for your antlered elk tag, you're blocked from applying for a depredation tag.
You were blocked from the application?
Correct. Once you've applied, once you either submit your application or submit your choices for your antlered elk tag, you can no longer apply for the antlered elk depredation tag. Yet if you read the booklet, it clearly states that we could apply for all 3.
Jack Robb for the record. We discovered that after the draw started. Calcami did as directed and made it so that they couldn't do that. We have to review that, and we will, during season setting, ask the commission whether we want people eligible to apply for spike, bull, and depredation bull. But there was some confusion between the department and Calcami. But once that process started, we were aware of the issue. It was printed in the booklet. There's still some confusion among some staff as to what it reads, but we're going to get some clarification this year, and we'll make sure the booklet reads right, whether you can or can't. But the booklet was different than what was in process, and a lot of our own employees brought that to our attention. So we are aware of it. It needs to be discussed this year when that time comes during season setting and eligibility.
So I thought we said you could apply for spike and antlered elk, but only draw one?
Correct.
That's what the commission did. I don't know if we had the discussion on the depredation. I don't remember. I'd have to go back and look.
Yeah, we had some discrepancies, and we've tried to review the tapes, and Maureen and I have talked about it, and I'm not clear on it. Even today, knowing that the issue is occurring, I'm not clear. But we are going to ask for clarification next year, or this coming year, to make sure that the book reflects exactly what is occurring in the system. But once you hit that thing and it goes live, hot fixes, we've done them in the past. They're less than optimal, and when we do those, you chance breaking the whole thing. And for the amount of people it was a frustration to, we did not go after a hot fix.
I just want to say, Zach Lambert, for the record, we can support it either way. In whatever direction we're given is not a problem.
I wasn't aware that there was an issue, so thanks for bringing it to our attention Did you have another question?
Oh, just to add on to that, I mean, I have the language in front of me. If you'd like, I could read it to you, but it clearly states, it's in the eligibility section, and there's even a specific question and answer in that section that states, the question is, I put in for antlered elk, can I apply for spike elk hunt and antler depredation hunt in the same draw? Answer, yes. And I would say Zach's answer to that would probably be no. And I don't think that's much of an issue, other than there's several people that have expressed frustration or concern in the fact that this is the second year that that's been the case. And because of that, if they had any bonus points that they had accrued for that depredation hunt or the other, obviously generally people are going to choose the antlered hunt over the depredation hunt, but if they had any bonus points that they had accrued for that depredation hunt, those points have now been purged because they haven't applied for 2 consecutive years. And at this point going forward, there's no ability to accrue any bonus points for the depredation hunts going forward, is my understanding.
I don't know.
Is there a way to fix that, Jack? Is there a way to go back to?
It's a head
review
scratcher.
those?
It's not going to be easy. We're going to have to review tapes. We've already done a lot of that, but if the limited number of people that there's some legacy bonus points out there. You can't accrue bonus points on depredation elk hunts anymore. It hasn't been in effect for quite a while. There's some legacy ones that were out there from 5-6 years ago that did have a few bonus points because there was a short time period you could accrue bonus points for depredation elk. If we found that we were in error, we will fix that error. We would not let the customer suffer because we had an error on our side.
So how is that going to happen? Do they need to contact the department?
We can query all that stuff
Okay.
out, and we can find it easy enough. Finding that stuff is easier than fixing it, I can tell you that.
Any additional questions? Mr. Reese?
For the record, Mike Reese, when you were explaining the party application, I'm going to use a scenario. You got 3 people, person A, B, and C. Person A's got 1 bonus point, and person B's got 2, person C's got 3. Okay, totals up to 6. How do you average that out, or how do you arrive at you're going to be issued the numbers?
It's averaged. Sorry, for the record, Zach Lambert, it's averaged, and if it comes out to like a half number, we round up to the nearest whole number.
Okay, but in there you said that there was a single person used for the draw. So if you've got 3 people in there,
Those 3 people have submitted 1 application. The bonus points for that 1 application.
I got you. Okay.
Yeah, and that
okay.
1 application has to eat however many quota or tags.
1 application with 3 names on
Yep.
it. Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Any additional questions?
Sorry. Zach, I'm confused because I'm not a math person. Is this hypothetical on this first page that someone with 5 bonus points gets 26 numbers and someone with 3 gets 10? Or is that?
That's real.
That's real.
That's real.
So
We square the number.
So this formula down here that I don't understand, that's.
Yeah, that formula is, again, it was used by the prior contractor. I think we were required to use that
Okay.
random number as well.
Bonus point squared plus 1.
Okay.
There's certain variables within that equation. It's a little bit over my head.
That's what I figured.
But
Okay.
essentially, when you plug in the random number range that you want into that equation, that's where it begins to produce random numbers from 1 to 100 million.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Did you get that answered? So the random number generator is what's used in the 3 bonus point, the 10 times you get 10 random numbers, but the way we get from 3 to 10 is 3 squared plus 1. And the
5 squared plus.
yeah.
1. And then that's the formula for yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Any final questions? Okay, with that, we'll thank you.
Thank you.
On that presentation. We'll move on to agenda item 20. Didn't think we'd ever get there. Future commission meetings and commission committee assignments, Secretary Wasley and Chairman Johnston for possible action. The next commission meeting is scheduled for September 20th and 21st in Las Vegas. The commission will review and discuss potential agenda items. For that meeting, the commission may change the time and meeting location at this time. The chairman may designate and adjust committee assignments as necessary at this meeting. First, do we know where we're going to be meeting in Las Vegas?
Clark County Government Center, I believe.
Okay. I had shed hunting reg. Extenuating circumstances that could allow a person to transfer a tag, return a tag, or defer a tag. The reg on statutory cap. If we meet the statutory cap on the landowner compensation tags for deer and antelope. Those were 3 things I had.
Did you want to have a committee meeting, a landowner damage committee meeting, or do you just want the committee staff to bring that recommendation before the full commission?
I'd like to start I guess we could do the workshop in September with the department bringing the draft regulation for the incremental increase in the number of animals required to get your subsequent tags if the statutory cap is exceeded. And then what if it's possible to follow up on today's CAB workshop, could we have an informational item on what the buck doe management objectives are by unit? Just a quick presentation on that. And
Absolutely.
What units are different? What's your standard units? What's the different units? And flush that out just in I think, fairly simple informational item. Because I think that would be very good for people to have well in advance of getting the big game status book and quota and season settings following on this presentation today.
Absolutely. Does that conclude your list? I have a few things to add if you're ready.
Let's go.
Clark County Government Center has indicated we will video stream the teleconference to Reno. I don't know if we will to Elko or not. I know we made commitments to Elko for season setting and quota setting. We'll need to look at the logistics for that to determine if that's going to be available there for Elko. The main order of business in odd number of years, we do fishing regs at that September meeting, so we will have some fishing regs. We also have a Wildlife Trust Fund report to give to the commission. There was a request at one point in time, Mr. Chairman, I believe you interacted with a member of the public who was requesting a presentation on the Pittman-Robertson Act and the funding derived from that and what was and wasn't eligible. Just it was, I think, Jana Wright that had expressed a desire to have that presentation. I can communicate with you offline.
We can do. I think, yeah, that something like that. I can't remember anymore.
Yeah,
it's been a long day.
And then you had requested that perhaps in September, when we were in Las Vegas, some background on the U hunts as far as when they began, where, why, numbers since their inception in terms of tag success, etc., alternatives to those hunts, including trapping and transplanting options within and outside Nevada and limitations to those options. So we can put an informational item on there based on your request as well.
That was my request, yep.
I believe we would also like to provide the commission the opportunity to actually present the Kirch Award since the recipient is a resident of Southern Nevada. I think there may be an opportunity to do that. And then we'll have our usual tenure recognition, department project update. At this point, I think we're looking at possibly looking at some Muddy River and Warm Springs natural area restoration work with an update and field trip on the department project update. But certainly if the commission has something else in mind, let us know and we can accommodate that. And then we'll also look for a conservation partner to spotlight. I think that concludes my list. There was also the possibility, I guess, of update on the both Fallon and Nellis. So if that's something the commission would want, we could do that as well.
Chairman Johnston.
Yes.
We're hoping most of the commissioners are going to be able to travel to Vegas early Thursday. We're hoping that there are no committees meeting on Thursday. If they do meet, it's before 6 p.m. And if they do decide to have a committee meet, we have a new location for them to meet on Pepper Lane, just by the airport. We are going to have an open house ribbon cutting that day, and we would like all the commissioners. We're going to invite all the legislative members and constitutional office or constitutional people. We're going to have an event because we're proud of where we're going to, and we have something we want to show off to everybody. So that'll be Thursday at 6 o'clock. I'm hoping everybody can make it.
Yep. And we will we'll share some additional information on that in the near future. I did have one last item that came out of the recent WAFWA meeting that I forgot I had on my list. I had a conversation with some ammunition manufacturers that deal with non-toxic ammunition, who said they would be available in the area at that time if our commission desired a brief informational update on what they have, performance, just as a informational awareness on non-toxic ammunition availability and options.
An informational item or a marketing piece by the ammunition manufacturers?
Actually, maybe I misrepresented when I said manufacturer. They are information. They aren't.
Okay.
There aren't ammunition dealers. They work in non-toxic ammunition, but not as sales per se. They're not a manufacturer.
How long is our presentation going to be? We're getting a pretty lengthy agenda here
Yeah,
already.
I don't know. Brian, do you have any idea what the duration of the informational presentation might be? Or can you provide any additional background on who those guys were that we spoke with? I know you spoke with them at greater length than I did.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, Brian Wakeling. They can probably make the presentation about as short or as long as the interest would be. Chris Parrish is the lead. Leland is the other guy's name. I can't remember his last name. They're with the non-toxic partnership. They work with, there's a number of folks that have signed on to the partnership. For instance, the National Wild Turkey Federation, I know, is one of the groups that have signed on to it. I'm not sure if Mule Deer Foundation has. I believe they have the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. So they're trying to basically bring an awareness of the use or the effectiveness of non-toxic shock because of the proximity to the shooting range. They're down there. They also had extended the offer that if anybody wanted to come out, they might be able to show a live demonstration. Even without the live demonstration, they've got a lot of existing the shot gel that they could use that demonstrates what the penetration and efficacy of the two side by side. And so my sense is that they could probably do 20 minutes. They could do half a day. I don't think the commission's looking for half a day, but they did make that offer.
Let's see what the agenda looks like, and I don't want to make it too lengthy. This is an action item. Any comment or any public comment? Saying none. Any comments or questions from the commission? Then I will work with the department, Jack and Tony, for the agenda in Las Vegas. Okay, with that, we'll close agenda item 20, move on to item 21, public comment period. Persons wishing to speak are requested to complete a speaker's card and present it to the recording secretary. Public comment will be limited to 3 minutes. No action can be taken by the commission at this time. Any item requiring commission action may be scheduled on a future commission agenda. Any public comment? All right, I want to thank everyone again for their hospitality, and I know today went longer than I expected, but I also think it was extraordinarily informative, and I really, really appreciate the work that Cody, Calcami, Brian, the whole department put into this. I know I have a much better understanding of the quota setting process and what goes into it and how we get there, and answered a lot of my questions, and I think it'll be, I'm hoping, a more efficient process when we get into future quota settings, understanding this, since deer numbers are oftentimes some of the ones that are discussed the most. So in any event, thank you all. We'll see you in Las Vegas in September.